Well met, Slayers of Giants. Yes, I'm coming to you from my car again this week. We'll see about the sound quality. I hope it is better than last week's. But this is where I can record this week, so I hope this works. Welcome to Chapter 16 of my serial novel, Tilting at Windmills. Remember, this is a draft, and this particular chapter was extremely difficult to write for reasons which will soon be apparent. From a literary perspective, it plays with exactly the tension I wanted to explore with the book's unusual point of view, employing the power of the painful honesty I've tried to achieve in my poetry, and then pairing that with this weird distance created by the high modernism of the narrator talking about an only slightly fictionalized version of the author. I'm curious to learn what emotional impact that will have on you, the reader. I don't know if a warning this vague qualifies as a content warning, but the first part makes reference to the character's mental health challenges and some of the more unpleasant facts of our nonfiction world. And I encourage you to read on if that's not too difficult, because we do get back to more enjoyable and amusing parts of the adventure before the end. I feel all of this, the good and the bad, is necessary to get to where the story is headed, but you may disagree. And as I say each week, there are lots of changes I'll be making to the final manuscript based on feedback from readers who have posted in the comments on Substack and Patreon. If you notice anything, from the smallest typo to the largest structural change, I'll be very grateful for your notes. So become a patron of my Patreon or subscribe to my Substack so you'll get a little reminder each week when a new chapter comes out. And if you know someone who might enjoy the show, tell them to go back and catch up with you. And maybe tell them not to start with this one. Tilting at Windmills, Chapter 16. Put Together and Falling Apart. You've probably heard Plato's myth of the cave, but in case you missed it, here's a quick and dirty version. Some people are chained up in a cave. They've been there since birth and don't know anything but the cave. They have a little fire that keeps them just warm enough to live, and while they huddle around it, they make a puppet show on the wall with shadows to tell one another what the world outside the cave is like. Then one day, one of them manages to break his bonds and stumbles out of the cave. He feels the warmth of the sun. He sees real animals and trees and grass. He realizes so much of what he imagined during the shadow puppet shows was false. So he bravely goes back into the cave to rescue his comrades. But they don't believe him about the world outside the cave because the things he describes are so out of keeping with their lived experience, they decide he's crazy and choose to remain in the cave. This story is used to explain all kinds of messianic figures who see something real about the world and are not believed. But consider, what if the guy was forced to go back into the cave? What if he felt the warmth of the sun during the day, but the night was too cold and he had to return to the humble fire inside to stay alive? What if the animals he saw outside, beautiful as they were compared to the shadow puppets, were also dangerous carnivores, and he had to flee back into the cave for safety? What if he's just a human, and, as such, a social animal, and he can't live outside the cave without the company of other people? In this version, the person is no hero. Yes, he may have seen more of the world than the people inside, and yes, it is tragic they don't believe him, but he calculates that it's better to live in a community that thinks he's mad, and may drive him to madness with their constant incorrect assertions about the world in their puppet show, but he'd rather survive in that community than die alone. He's not a messiah, not even a brave truth-teller. He's just a guy who got out and came slinking back, his experience doing no one any good. Benjamin thought he knew about his own country. He'd committed that if the government fell into the hands of a fascist regime, he'd leave. In addition to being genuinely afraid of the MAGA crazies who were spamming his DMs with death threats because of his political activism, he worried his own stress during a second Trump administration would lead to a heart attack. Chris had agreed with his assessment, both of the risks posed by the fascist regime and by Benjamin's stress. But she'd been so certain Kamala Harris would win the 2024 election, she hadn't wanted to engage in any planning. The day after the election, they began their hasty retreat. During the next few months, Benjamin continued to work, trying to prepare for the move in his off hours, and also writing a whole book explaining why he felt he had to leave and asking others to consider the ways they would resist. Meanwhile, Chris and their kid felt so overwhelmed by it all, they couldn't be very active in the preparations. During this period, the corporation that was the umbrella over the franchise Chris owned learned of their plans to leave the country and illegally seized the store. Instead of stopping to reassess the plan to leave, Mostly motivated by sheer terror of what the next administration might do to the country and to dissenting activists like him, Benjamin plowed ahead, now without the resources from the sale of the store and without fully reckoning with the fact that two people who got too overwhelmed and couldn't fully engage in the preparation might be similarly overwhelmed and disengaged by an international move. In retrospect, the result was predictable. They spent thousands on the initial travel, thousands more on an immigration attorney, thousands on temporary housing while waiting on their residency, and when they finally had the legal ability to remain in Spain, Chris could only find a half-time job and their kid couldn't find any work. The financial plan hinged on them working until Benjamin's small publishing company or his own writing could allow him to contribute sufficiently. But even that was a pipe dream. The company had barely made enough to continue to exist when he was operating it in his off hours while working as a full-time teacher. In Spain, when he had more hours to devote to it, the sales didn't magically increase by a multiple commensurate to the time he devoted. And the more panicked he became, the more he worked, meaning he left the two people who had already shown they struggled when feeling overwhelmed, now feeling abandoned by this spectral presence in their apartment who constantly resented them. Ultimately, the family admitted defeat and returned to the U.S. Benjamin and Chris reunited and recommitted themselves to one another. Chris and their kid found work within days of their return, and after moving back to Portland, Benjamin started working as a substitute teacher. And he should have begun to heal. But he didn't. Instead, he felt like that latter example of the person returning to the cave. He hadn't come back volitionally to spread the gospel of living in a nation with a strong social safety net and far less violence. He had to come back, and now, living amongst people trying to understand an empire descending into fascism with only the language of shadow puppets, Benjamin could feel that his constant anxiety about finances in Spain had been replaced and even increased by his constant worry about gun violence, political oppression, and yes, still finances, but now in a country which treated poverty as a moral failing deserving of punishment. Sometimes when a person sustains a physical injury, especially if it involves some foreign body piercing the skin, they will seem to recover temporarily. The skin will heal up on the surface. They will feel better. Then they might get a slight fever. The injury, still tender, will become hot to the touch. The area around the seemingly healed wound, once pink, will turn a darker color, like a bruise. It may swell or form blisters. And when this heated, blistering flesh bursts, a pus will come out which smells terrible. Some people have strange predilections regarding specific smells. You can find people who don't object to the smell of skunks, for example. But this omniscient narrator will go out on a limb, pardon the pun, and say no human being likes this smell. That's because the brain is hardwired to recognize it as a direct threat. The olfactory senses scream directly into the brain. This will kill you. Get as far away from the source of this smell as possible. It is literally the smell of death. Damage to veins caused by the injury itself or by a resulting bacterial infection have prevented part of the body from receiving oxygenated blood. The tissue, starved and strangulated, turns black. The body, sensing the danger, sends white blood cells to fight the infection, creating the pus and the fever. But by the time the person becomes aware of the gangrene, it's often too late. The limb may need to be amputated. And even this may not be enough. Gangrene is often fatal. Benjamin had begun to suspect he had the emotional analog to gangrene, a psychological rot which continued to plague him and was arguably getting worse after his first few months in Portland. Working for a private company which farmed substitute teachers out to the school districts around the city, he had no trouble getting work because of his experience in bilingualism. Getting back into the classroom and making positive connections with students sometimes reminded him he had a skill set that made him feel valuable. But he also learned he had far less patience with student behavior, with failing school systems, and with the ways the larger American society constantly screamed it did not care about child welfare. During his first months back in the United States, the duly elected representatives of the American people, both in the predictably erratic and corrupt executive branch and in the predictably obsequious and feckless legislative branch, decided the country's highest priority, as measured by government attention, financial investment, and the sacrifice of lives, was a new war against a country which had not attacked the United States and which everyone agreed posed no imminent military threat. Those in government had learned, through a series of escalations, that the American people wouldn't rise up and challenge them when they murdered foreign nationals in boats and labeled them drug runners, then murdered Americans at home and called them domestic terrorists, then abducted a foreign head of state and risked a war and possible global oil shock. Thus emboldened, they started the next war thinking no one in the U.S. with any significant power would oppose them. And they were correct. Unfortunately for the American regime, as they often say in the military, the enemy gets a vote, and the country the U.S. had attacked declined to capitulate. The American regime, unaccustomed to pushback, didn't know what to do, and they fell into a cycle of bluster and deceit, claiming they had already won and would win, would also continue to attack but didn't need to attack, and would negotiate but didn't need to negotiate, all while the other regime gained more economic and diplomatic power than they'd had at the beginning of the war, at the expense of the suffering of their civilian population, who they hadn't cared much about to begin with. And while this foreign adventurism may have seemed like an unfortunate but not personally pressing issue to most Americans, Benjamin couldn't help but connect it to the problems his students faced every day in the classrooms he was dropped into. Students were expected to use school-appropriate language while their president tweeted on his privately owned social media network, "Open the fucking straight, you crazy bastards, or you'll be living in hell." Students were expected to focus on their learning while their government was threatening to destroy another civilization entirely. And students were supposed to believe their efforts would result in some kind of personal benefit, while the average American confronted spiking gas prices, flat or diminishing wages, ballooning healthcare and education costs, and the kleptocrats in the president's family and close circle traded on insider information and got no-bid government contracts, enriching themselves to the tune of billions of dollars. In a country which had decided to use money as a metric for the value of work and land and property and even rights and freedoms, it was impossible for anyone to pretend the larger society cared much about its own children or their futures. Benjamin welcomed students at the door of classrooms for kindergartners, 8th graders, and seniors in high school, trying to express that the students were valued and safe and ought to get to work on their studies. All well knowing many felt threatened by dangers far more pressing than anything he could counterbalance with a lesson on punctuation or animal biology or persuasive thesis statements. Once he subbed in a high school class focused on preparing students to work in early childhood education, and the lesson happened to be about child abuse prevention and mandatory reporting requirements. Benjamin followed the lesson to a T and didn't elaborate, but he wondered if students questioned the value of requirements demanding that the adults who were supposed to protect them sent reports of suspicions of neglect or abuse to more powerful people who, at best, clearly demonstrated disdain for the welfare of children, and at worst were involved in horrible crimes against children themselves, or worked to protect those who were. Propaganda outlets and siloed social media feeds may have deceived many adults into believing their team was right to protect a regime of abusers, but kids tend to be more savvy about bullshit than most adults, whose entrenched interests cause them to reject realities that don't match up with their priors. The more Benjamin sank into the suspicion the country couldn't do what it needed to do in order to provide its children with a hopeful future, the less he could hide that conclusion from the students themselves. This pervasive sense of failure to escape and despair at the land to which he'd returned weakened Benjamin from the inside out. The more weakened Benjamin became, the stronger his need to imagine someone, anyone, taking the country's deterioration seriously. So Rolando grew more and more solid. He didn't become taller or stronger, and this diminishing of his inventor didn't augment Rolando's magic. His growing verisimilitude took the form of dropping roots, forming a routine, becoming a more established person. Serge and Rolando didn't waste much time standing on the shore south of Lincoln City processing Callie's transformation and departure. They were concerned for the safety of Brianna, the Anhana they'd met in Corvallis. A little more than an hour after Callie made her flying leap into the Pacific, the two knights-errant found street parking a short distance away from the apartment where they'd paid an exorbitant amount to purchase an absent college student's room for the night. "How do you want to play this?" Serge asked. "Just knock and make sure no one is home, then teleport our way in again?" Rolando shook his head. "I think there may be another path of egress, my friend." They got out of the car, and Rolando encouraged Serge to bring his sword just in case. Serge looked back and forth on the mostly deserted road. He could see a woman walking her dog a block away, and a jogger ran across the street even further off, but no one was in their immediate vicinity at the moment. Still, he felt intensely uncomfortable. "I really need to find a way to disguise this," he said. "Don't worry too much. They may already see it as a cane or a crutch, or maybe as a cosplay toy, Rolando said. It is a magical sword. If they choose not to see magic, their perception will wash over it just as they would a fully grown giant or a planeswhite or something even larger. There are magical creatures larger than planeswhites? Rolando nodded. Leviathans in the ocean, dragons in the mountains, these can get very large. And who knows what may exist in space? Magical interstellar whales that swallow whole planets? We could already be in one's belly. Serge scowled at Rolando. Do you say things like that just to freak me out? Rolando shrugged. A little bit. If we are in the belly of a space whale, why feel self-conscious that humans may think you are carrying a toy sword? They approached the side of the single building containing the multiple conjoined row houses. Rolando scanned it and found what he was looking for. Behind some bushes, trimmed to waist height, a spigot allowed for the attachment of a garden hose used by the landscaping company to maintain the yard, which was mostly covered in dark bark dust, but did contain neatly trimmed bushes and some young trees. Crouching down behind the hedge so they were mostly obscured, the men turned on the water just enough to create a thin stream, which splattered into a small, muddy puddle in the dirt. Rolando whispered an incantation into the head of his cane, and the rivulet of water widened and distended slightly, forming the body of the Anhana. Hey guys, Brianna said. It's nice to see you, but I really don't like to get this far from the apartment. The duende will sneak into the kitchen and rearrange the pantry, or mix up the pans and the Tupperware, or... Brianna, we are so relieved to see you, Serge interrupted. She stopped suddenly because she hadn't told him her name. She'd consciously withheld it because she knew a mage like Rolando could use that to compel her to do things on his behalf. Now she found this pair of humans knew her name somehow, but before she could blast them with her magic and retreat into the house, Serge explained. Ariel Honan sent us to find you. Along the way we discovered that Lana, Rihanna, and Joanna have all gone missing. At least one of them has probably been captured by a warlock and some pig guys. It's not safe for you to stay here. The 6-inch-tall elemental spirit placed her hands over her mouth in horror. Oh, my sisters, that's terrible. We are going to search for them and attempt to rescue them, Rolando assured her. But first we must take you somewhere safer. She looked over her shoulder. But my humans. I've committed to protect them from the duende. Serge looked to Rolando. The old man grinned impishly. I have an idea about that. The apartment Chris had found for herself and her kid, back when it seemed Benjamin would move permanently to Cleveland, was located in the heart of Portland's downtown, in the neighborhood called Old Town, just blocks from Chinatown, the train station, and Tom McCall Waterfront Park. Before moving to Spain, Chris had felt anxious about the downtown area, disliking driving on one-way streets and exhausted by the constant presence of so many people. Now she freely admitted she never would have felt comfortable in the bustling center of a metro area of 2.5 million people, without first living in the middle of a city more than twice as populous. Benjamin, on the other hand, had chafed at the size and relative remoteness of the small town where he'd lived for more than 20 years before the move to Barcelona. He loved the people there, and as a teacher at the high school, he taught almost everyone or their child or older sibling, but he'd longed to be closer to a big city's art, literary, and political scene. Well, he understood consciously that an event with 20 attendees in a small town, be it a protest or a poetry reading or a city council meeting, might have just as much individual meaning and could be objectively measured as even more important because it included a larger percentage of the population than 100 people in a park or bookstore or auditorium in a much bigger city. Somehow, the quantity of humans made him feel irrationally connected to something greater, the secular equivalent to the difference between the identity-consuming experience of a megachurch worship service or a professional sporting event versus an intimate Bible study or pickup basketball game with close friends. Benjamin attributed his comfort in crowds to his childhood experiences navigating the coffee hour at the churches where his parents were pastors, always feeling, for good and ill, like a part of a very large family. What he could not admit to himself was that he carried a deep fear that any validation which came from only a few people might disappear if those people did. Childhood moves had led him to believe people could vanish from his life, and in his adulthood, the normal estrangement of old friends over time and at great distances, combined with some shocking relationship breakdowns, reinforced his irrational belief that he needed to be seen and recognized by lots of people, or he could disappear into a kind of painful obscurity at the whims of a few unreliable confidants. Simultaneously, he wanted to be anonymous within huge crowds in order to feel like he was part of something made meaningful by nothing more than its size. If he could have identified these things about himself, he would have hated them, and felt deeply ashamed of what they revealed about his lack of character. Fortunately, he remained blissfully unaware, concealing it all within a label. "I'm a big city guy," he'd say, and not reflect on it more closely. So when he had a chance to live in Chris's apartment in the heart of Portland, he felt the same kind of thrill he'd enjoyed when walking from their apartment in the tiny maze-like streets of Barcelona up La Rambla to the Plaza Catalunya, where two great fountains dance in the midst of a square of cabs and double-decker buses surrounded by tens of thousands of tourists and commuters on foot and bikes and strollers. Benjamin loved the energy generated by so many people, with all their stories and foibles and languages and social presentation, mingling and bouncing off one another in these tight but remarkably orderly spaces. In Portland, within a few weeks of his arrival, he was attending book launches and poetry readings, and had splurged to purchase a helmet, goggles, and a megaphone for his frequent trips to protest at the ice facility. Though he'd fallen into the negative as measured by dollars and cents, he was employed and thus engaged in a long marathon race against the high-interest credit card debt, and he knew he would eventually be okay on that front. Hell, the cherry blossoms in Waterfront Park bloomed, and he got to stroll with his wife and dogs beneath a canopy of awesome beauty down to the Saturday market beneath the Burnside Bridge, eat some of the most delicious food he'd found anywhere in the world, purchased from food carts next to booths selling jewelry made out of bent antique silverware. He should have been happy. But the rot was there, not yet chewing on his guts with the ferocity it would find, but nibbling, picking, tearing off tiny bits of his sense of self. It compelled him to seek solace in long, late-night walks, the kind he'd employed in Barcelona when it seemed everything would fall apart. It had fallen apart. They'd survived, and yet here he was, wandering under streetlights, sharing shadows with the houseless population, looking out at the lights of the convention center and the rose garden, their reflections bobbing on the surface of the fast-moving river. Unbeknownst to Benjamin, the man he'd noticed into existence at the Portland airport months before had rented a nearby condo, nicer and far more expensive than Chris's apartment, and nearly crossed paths with his creator many times as the men navigated the same city. But while Benjamin stumbled through his sadness, drove while distracted by contemplations that didn't belong behind the wheel, and missed a lot of the beauty and joy of the city, hidden behind the veil of his confusion about where he was, how he got there, and where he ought to be, Rolando, in contrast, walked through his life in Portland with clear purpose. He needed to train Sir Sanchez of the town of Eels, guardian of justice and protector of mermaidens, at least to the point where the two knights-errant could hold their own against the abductors of the Anjana and hopefully learn more about the curse which plagued the United States. Serge moved into Rolando's apartment full-time, both as a demonstration of his commitment to his new calling and for practical reasons. Though he was sure Rolando would cover his rent through his salary, he'd never received a formal paycheck from his employer. He wasn't even sure he was employed by Rolando anymore. But he spent his days in a kind of monastic regimen, obeying the older knight's every command, working and studying himself into exhaustion and an early bedtime each evening. Life in Rolando's apartment had a bit more drama than could have been produced by the two knights busy with their training. As they went about their days in the apartment, they dodged around the continual conflict between Brianna, who mostly resided in the pipes, and Kudori Nuzzleshead, the duende, who made his nest in a box on the shelf in Serge's closet. Rolando had used his knowledge of Kudori Nuzzleshead's real name to magically compel the duende to move with them to the new apartment in Portland, freeing Brianna from her obligation to protect the humans she'd adopted in Corvallis, but forcing the two of them into even closer proximity. So Kudori Nuzzleshead did what duendes do, causing small bits of mischief for his own amusement at Serge and Rolando's expense, and Brianna did what Anjanas do, imbuing the men with subtle hints of better-than-average luck and protecting them from the duende's more egregious pranks with occasional blast of her magic. And the two shouted insults at one another all day long. The apartment had a fifth resident, the djinn Mukhadi, who was still trapped in Rolando's flashlight. He occasionally burst into fits of shouting, muffled somewhat by the casing of the maglite, but still mostly audible, which started with obscenities directed at his captors, then turned into pleas for Brianna or Kudori Nuzzleshead to set him free, then evolved into angry demands that the duende and Anjana shut up. Serge once complained to Rolando that Mukhadi's rants against Brianna and Kudori Nuzzleshead were often longer than their exchanges had been, but Orlando reminded Serge the djinn didn't have anything else to do with his time. Despite the noisy roommates, Serge and Rolando's lives fell into a consistent routine. Before dawn, Rolando would wake Serge, and they'd ascend to the condo's private rooftop patio, where Rolando would lead Serge through a series of stretches, calisthenics, tai chi, then faster martial arts kata before practicing sword fighting. After a few hours, they'd eat a large breakfast, then practice meditation and focus exercises Serge would eventually rely on for spellcasting. Then, after a small lunch, Serge would read for a couple hours, the curriculum ranging from text on magical creatures, the formulas for potions, histories of the magical world and its intersection with the non-magical one, and accounts of the exploits of famous knights. Often Serge couldn't tell how much of each book he was supposed to believe. Surely some of the accounts of the knights had to be fish stories, but if that was the case, how much of the history of the magical world relied on those same serial exaggerators who, in service to the code, sought to bring glory to themselves and the ladies or gentlemen to whom they were pledged through accounts clearly biased toward their own heroism? And if the histories were a similar mix of bragging and reality, how could he tell what was truly going on in the world of magic? Serge asked Rolando about this.
"This is a very legitimate concern, my friend," Rolando said. "The solution, you will find, is the exact same one necessary to separate truth from falsehood when studying human history. Read more."
After these reading sessions, the two men would hop in the car and drive out to some remote place to practice fighting on different terrain. Here, Oregon demonstrated one of its greatest gifts, the variety of natural environments accessible within a few hours' drive. Snow-capped mountains? Check. Thick rainforests? Check. Sand dunes? The very dunes which inspired Frank Herbert's Dune novels are not located in the Sahara in Africa or the Gobi in Asia, but on the Oregon coast. Rolando even found places for them to practice on human-made terrain, but outside the watchful eyes of humans. Abandoned malls, warehouses, and train yards. During these fights, they didn't use Baganawatig or Makadawabide, their magical swords. Even sheathed, Rolando worried Serge's Baganawatig might electrocute him, and his Makanawabide might cut through its own sheath. Instead, they used wooden bokken for kata, unsharpened metal aito for form, and flexible polypropylene swords for sparring. These durable thermoplastic polymer swords were a little too light for Rolando's taste. He wished they weighed as much as their real swords and had the same balance. But the men could spar far longer with the lighter blades, and these didn't cause much more than small bruises when Rolando connected with Serge's body. Serge, on the other hand, never hit Rolando. Not once. The older man was faster, stronger, and seemed not to need to breathe, even when he fought uphill on snow or sand or stairs. As he fought, he kept his shoulders perpendicular to Serge, and his raven, Poe, perched on his far shoulder, watching. If Serge was particularly successful, it was only demonstrated by the bird flapping its wings in order to maintain its balance as Rolando dodged. Most of the time, the bird stood perfectly still, content on its perch, occasionally laughing at Serge and making comments to Rolando in Catalan. Serge grew to resent the bird so much he found he was aiming less at Rolando than at the large corvid standing just behind his mentor's head. Not only did Rolando not need to catch his breath during these training sessions, but he could speak as he fought, lecturing Serge in a calm, even tone. The closest Serge got to distracting him occurred when Rolando would struggle with some idiomatic expression in English which didn't make sense when translated in his head. During these sessions, Serge was exposed to a number of lessons which would become vital later on, but which he only half absorbed at the time because he was so focused on trying to score even a single point against the man who kept whacking him with a plastic sword. For example, one evening when they'd driven out to Smith Rock to practice on uneven, treacherous ground, in the midst of a match where Serge should have had all the advantages but couldn't manage to drive his teacher further down a rough embankment to a natural stone wall below them, Rolando patiently explained that Serge should do his best to keep his real sword sheathed for as long as possible before a real fight. "You will find you can defend yourself reasonably well with the sword still sheathed. If you need to cause harm, it can even suffice. Though, if you must kill, it's better to do so with the blade. Kinder that way. But by keeping the sword sheathed, you will refrain from doing the kind of harm you cannot undo. As a knight, you must be prepared to take decisive action. If you commit to a cause, you will not always be afforded the luxury to hesitate and reconsider. But, when possible, you should, as you Americans say, dry your powder." Serge, who'd been smacking furiously at Rolando's sword to no avail, took a few steps back up the hill and tried to catch his breath, but muttered between gasps, "Keep your powder dry."
"Yes, this makes more sense. Keep your powder dry. As you witnessed after our confrontation with the giant, there are magical means to repair most injuries. But, to my knowledge, there is no way to go back in time and change the fact that the injury was dealt in the first place."
"Oh, there's no going back in time potion? No time-traveling phone booth or necklace or anything?"
"Not that I am aware of," Rolando said. "There are magical means to accelerate oneself so much that it seems time has stopped, and there are ways to go into a kind of hibernation, so that a great deal of time can pass without one's experiencing it. But those are only time travel within relativistic time. Our actions in the universe exist, and cannot be undone. Words, when spoken, cannot be unsaid. And swords, once unsheathed, communicate a willingness to stab or cut, which is not easily forgotten."
Serge understood this as advice about swordplay, and it was only later he'd fully comprehend the value of the metaphor. Similarly, on one of their trips to the coast, this time to a broad beach covered in round, slippery rocks, Rolando said,
"In many conflicts, you will find the most direct route to your target is best. Think of this as the Occam's razor of swordplay. The simplest approach is probably correct. But this can also be used to fool you. People often mistake a simple explanation for a correct one based on this principle, but that is not what Occam's razor dictates. It means this is the pathway which should be explored and tested first. If you approach an enemy directly and you are rebuffed, do not persist in the same failed strategy. Be willing to learn, to adapt. Your initial assumption about the most effective strategy must not trap you in a predictable pattern, which can be exploited by an opponent."
Serge halted quite suddenly. "So you're telling me that I should stop trying to hit you?" He lowered his sword and pretended to saunter toward his master. Then, at the last second, he tried to stab the end of the dull plastic blade into Rolando's toe. Rolando stepped sideways and tapped Serge's blade with his own, directing it harmlessly into the rocks. Poe didn't have to flap its wings. But when Serge looked at Rolando's face, he found the old man smiled brightly at his gambit.
"Closer than usual. Now imagine if you'd wandered around the side of me before you made the attempt."
"Would that have worked?"
Rolando chuckled. "No, but perhaps it would have been even closer. Who knows?"
Poe let out the kind of ululating caw, which was clearly its laugh. This time, Serge didn't realize he was employing Rolando's advice immediately until he reflected on it later. He thought he was trying to start a conversation to distract Rolando so he could find an opening to catch a lucky hit. Only in hindsight would he realize the conversation eventually led to the advantage which would create such an opening. As Serge attempted to distract Rolando with conversation, he launched into a volley of blows, breaking up his speech into bursts. "So, you once told me, you'd tell me, the story of Poe. He was a person?" In the moment, Serge seemed to have failed. Rolando parried Serge's next few blows easily and said,
"Ah, yes, I think this is the time. It is a sad story, but I think you must come to understand this in order to understand familiars and what they do for the magic wielder. Though it is possible to perform some magic without a familiar, it is quite difficult. Every time you have witnessed my spellcasting, you have seen the work of Poe. A familiar assists in all things magical, not only helping to bring the spell's magic into the world, but also augmenting the spellcaster's power, sustaining their concentration, and making those spells last. Think of them like the Catholic's notion of a saint, an intercessor. A Catholic can pray to their God directly, of course, but they believe the praying to the saint, who then prays on their behalf, makes the prayer more likely to hold sway with their God, because the saint and the deity are already, as you Americans say, chummy."
"No one says chummy. At least, no one I know."
"Bosom buddies?"
"I think that was a TV show that was on before I was born."
"An advocate, then. The saint is like your attorney to God."
"Yeah, I get the concept. Raised Catholic."
"So you know."
Amid swings and thrusts, Serge managed, "The priest never talked about magical animals helping to cast spells, but I get the analogy."
"Yes, well, traditionally, this familiar is acquired through the magical equivalent of flipping through the phone book and picking a lawyer at random."
"Phone books Or also, before my time, old man.
Quite. Poe is unusual in this regard because I knew him when he was a living human. So I can tell you his story, and perhaps it will help you learn a bit about becoming a knight-errant, though I don't think it will be very instructive when we acquire your familiar.
I'm going to get a familiar too? Serge was so distracted by this discovery, he left a wide enough opening for Rolando to poke him hard in the solar plexus, then tap him on the side of his neck, just hard enough to let him know he would have been killed.
Try to maintain your focus, and I will tell you the story of my good friend Poe, my first squire, and my greatest failure as a knight-errant.
If you're excited about this project, please subscribe on YouTube, or like and share on TikTok or Reels, or whatever app you're on now. And if you're willing to support me as I craft this novel in serial form, please consider supporting my Substack or Patreon. Each week I'll give a shout out to some of those patrons. This week I'm thanking Substack subscribers Stacy Dubner and Patreon patrons Aaron and Isaac Mitchell. Isaac is a talented artist who does illustration, poster design, book cover design, and logo creation on commission. And I know this because he did the cover for one of my novels, The Sum of Our Gods. He's also a former student of mine, so that makes me extra proud of him. There's a link to his website in the show notes. Thank you, Aaron, Stacy, and Isaac, for your support. If any of you listeners are creators and have something to plug, please email NotAPipePublishing at NotAPipePublishing@gmail.com. See you back here next week for Chapter 17 of Tilting at Windmills. Teaser, the story of Poe, of course.